First to the Remuneration Tribunal decision yesterday on politicians' pay. A big pay rise has been recommended and will happen for federal MPs at least, lifting the backbenchers' salary by about $45,000 a year. And ministers, the Prime Minister, more than $100,000 a year. Will this be passed on to the state politicians, though? Normally these decisions are, but Victoria's Premier Ted Baillieu says it won't happen in his state. And joining us now, the Queensland Premier Anna Bligh, live from Brisbane. Premier, good morning to you. Will you be passing on the Remuneration Tribunal recommendation?
Good morning, David. No, that won't be happening here in Queensland. We have a very firm wages policy in the public sector, asking our workers to accept a wage increase of 2.5% with the possibility of more with productivity trade-offs. I've said that politicians here will have exactly the same wages policy as we expect of all of our frontline staff. So, no, we won't be taking any of those changes from the Commonwealth.
It sounds like a fair enough position. The federal government is also trying to tighten the belt on the public sector at the Commonwealth level as well. Does that strike you as a bit odd that while they're doing that, they're awarding themselves a big pay rise?
Well, as I understand it, David, this came out of the Remuneration Tribunal's considerations, and it comes hand in hand with the abolition of a whole lot of other conditions that pertain to federal politicians, not state. We don't have some of the things that they're abolishing.
Those travel perks, etc.
That's right. So, it's a bit oranges and apples when you compare it to a state jurisdiction. But I've been very clear. We've got some big pressures on our budget, and it hasn't been helped by all the disaster recovery work we're doing. And I don't expect our frontline public sector workers to be treated any differently than I expect my own team to be treated.
Nonetheless, the whole idea is having an independent remuneration tribunal make these decisions. They've made a decision. So how are you what's the mechanism going to be for setting politicians' pay in Queensland now?
Well, we'll have to give some consideration to that. At the moment, we do have a nexus that pegs state politicians to a backbencher's salary. We'll have to give some consideration to that in the future. But right now, I've already made the decision. It's already been implemented. Right across the state parliament, it's a 2.5% pay increase.
Let me turn to the big story for your government this week, the health department issues, the alleged embezzlement of $16 million. Now, the head of the department's ethical standards unit has been stood down. 2 other senior officers have been stood aside. But I want to ask you, what are the grounds for doing that? Because the investigations, as I understand it, are still underway. No wrongdoing has yet been proven by these particular people.
That's right, but what we have seen is a very, very serious crime committed, a serious theft from the Queensland taxpayer, and there are a number of investigations happening into the background of all of those processes. The people concerned have been stood aside on pay while the investigations are undertaken. We are engaged in very substantial reform of this department, and I think it's important that the people who are undertaking and overseeing those reforms in senior positions have absolutely no question about whether there was any failure by them in their responsibilities.
But on those grounds then, shouldn't the Minister also, Jeff Wilson, be stood aside? He ultimately has to take responsibility for what's going on there.
David, there's absolutely no suggestion, no evidence, nothing that would suggest that the Minister at any stage has had any involvement in any approval of any of these funds. There is, however, direct oversight of the processes that have led to this circumstance by some of the staff involved here. I don't make any comment on their culpability. What's happened here is the Director-General has stood them aside pending the outcome of the investigation. Now, it may well be that that one or more of them return to their position, but this is a very serious matter. I take it very seriously. I'm very angry about it. Queensland has a right to be angry about it, and I want to make sure that as we make big changes in that department, we've got the right people doing it.
It's not the first problem we've seen in Queensland Health, and this week you've announced you're going to split the department in 2, essentially. How much is that going to cost, though? Surely this is a pretty major process to go through.
David, we've been embarked on a very substantial program of reform with Queensland Health, and we've seen some tremendous results at the front line in patient care. Queensland now has the shortest elective medium waiting surgery times in Australia, and we've taken ourselves from number 6 in the country when it comes to emergency wait times to number 3. So really substantial reforms at the front line. Where I think it's failing is the backup support to those frontline staff from the corporate head office section. We are going to develop a whole new agency with focus and leadership on getting that part right. This will be done in a cost-neutral way. This is happening at the same time as we're seeing a voluntary redundancy program reduce the size of head office, so this can be achieved in a cost-neutral way, and that's what I'm requiring it to be done.
Is this whole debacle in Queensland Health going to affect your decision on election timing here? Because analysts are saying that it wouldn't be the smartest move to go to the polls early in the wake of what's happened.
Well, David, 2012 is the year that our state election was due. I always said that we wouldn't be going early because 2011 had to be a year of rebuilding and reconstruction, and that's what it's been. We have a very substantial reform program that I'll be taking to the next election. And look, these sort of things that happen are nobody enjoys it when things like this go wrong, but we'll be going to the election with a very strong program next year. I never was looking at an early election because 2011 had to be a rebuilding year.
What about the leadership tension that we're seeing federally? I'm wondering how much that's impacting on you in Queensland, and would a return to Kevin Rudd as federal Labor leader help Labor in Queensland?
Look, David, I'm not going to buy into federal leadership issues. I've got enough on my plate here in the state of Queensland. We've had a very big year. We've had a year, I think, the likes of which we're unlikely to see again for a long time. Obviously, the matters involving federal issues are one for the federal caucus.
Yeah, but is Julia Gillard an asset for you there as you face a state election?
Well, there's no doubt the federal government has tackled some tough issues this year, and whenever a government tackles tough issues, the electorate can often ask a lot of questions about them. I think as we see those issues settle into the electorate, as we've seen here in Queensland, concerns about whether or not pricing carbon would see a reduction in investment. Well, that hasn't happened. What we've seen is an increase in major investment, mining companies making huge multi-billion-dollar investments ever since that was settled in the federal parliament. So I think people are seeing that some of the early concerns aren't going to be realised here. But ultimately, when people go to the ballot box, I think they'll want to know, as they do in every state election, what's going to happen to my schools, my hospitals, my ambulance, my police service, and the things that matter at a state level. All
right, the final question. Reports out of Indonesia that they're cutting their imports of live cattle quite significantly from Australia, from 520,000 head a year to 280,000 head. Boxed meat also being cut too, those imports. What's that going to mean for cattle producers in the north of your state?
Oh, absolutely no doubt this will be devastating news for some of the cattle producers in the north of Queensland. When we saw the restrictions on exports earlier this year, when they were imposed, we moved very quickly with AgForce, with producers, and set up a task force. One of the early outcomes of that is we're now doing a business case on having an abattoir in Cloncurry near Mount Isa, so that producers in North Queensland may in fact be able to develop a domestic market in response to changes in the Indonesian market. But this is not good news for those producers leading into Christmas. It's been a tough year for cattle producers in the far north, but this just tells us how important it is to diversify our markets, and that's one of the reasons that Simon Crean and I yesterday announced extra resources going into developing a new food bowl for Australia in the northern part of Queensland, with new irrigation water entitlements to get crops and potentially increase cattle production with feedlots getting into those areas.
Queensland Premier Anna Bligh, thank you for joining us this morning.
Thank you.